front reporter for them. So I get to do a lot of things.
Over to David.
Hello, I'm David Condos. I'm the Western Kansas reporter for Kansas News Service. And yeah, happy to be here.
Great. We've got Will from Nebraska.
Hey everyone, Will Bauer from Nebraska Public Media. I am a reporter and producer, TV producer, radio reporter.
Awesome. Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I am Nebraska's harvest reporter, so I cover ag and rural communities.
Excellent. And above her on my screen is Sam Horton, soon to be NPR Midwest Newsroom Fellow as of Monday. Hi, Sam. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, I think I just introduced you. And then of course there's Steve.
Hello, I'm Steve Baccarat. I am an admirer of Luke Martin's works, so I'm glad he's doing this. And I am also the Midwest Newsroom's investigative editor.
Cool. And there's CJ.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to join this. I thought I had a commitment, but it got canceled. So I'm eager to sit in on this.
Okay, and then I'll have Vickie and Luke introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I am one of the team members at KCUR, the NPR affiliate in Kansas City. I work with Luke Martin, who is our race and culture reporter. I also work with the arts team and with Dan Margulies editing his work and fill in where else I'm needed.
Great. Awesome.
I am Luke Martin. I never thought I would hear Steve Baccarat tell me that he was a fan of my work. So that's very humbling and flattering. Well, flattering is, I guess, not the word, but what a compliment. Thank you, Steve. I've been race and culture reporter for 15 months now, but who's counting? And yeah, I don't know. That's about it. That's all there is for me.
Well, why don't you kick things off and tell us a little bit about this story that you covered over time?
It was a few months that we started in on it. To be kind of honest, we kind of got a late jump on it. It really became a story on the Kansas City scene in like mid-May of last year. I think it was May 10th was when Jean Peters Baker had a big press conference here saying that she had done, this reinvestigation of this case and that she thought that Kevin Strickland was innocent. And I think that our first story, KCUR's first story about it, was published at the beginning of June.
Just tell us who Jean Peters Baker is for those of us who don't know.
Yeah, she is the Jackson County prosecutor. Jackson County is here where Kansas City, Missouri is. And it was actually that office, the Jackson County prosecutor's office, that had charged Kevin Strickland back in 1979 of this original triple murder that happened in South Kansas City. So that was kind of an interesting, thing where you had the leader of this prosecutor's office coming out and telling everybody that her office, though she wasn't in charge of it back then, that her office had made this mistake, and she was gonna, she at that point, she basically publicly committed herself and her office to do whatever she could to right that wrong. And everybody here knows a good story, as well as Rachel Maddow, and that was kind of like what everybody latched onto was this idea of trying to right that past wrong. I think maybe Maddow maybe even had the story before we did, or about the same time. So yeah, that's kind of what kicked things off.
It was, to Luke's point, already a national story. CBS News had been covering it for years and had a bit of a relationship, the reporter did. And I'm blanking on her name right now, but she had interviewed Strickland several times. And so by the time Luke and I started working on the story, the prosecutor, Jean Peters Baker, had already held this press conference, as Luke said. And I think also during the press conference, when she became choked up over the travesty the terrible wrong, as she called it, that Kevin Strickland had endured. I think that really captured people because it is rare that we hear prosecutors with tears choking their voice. And our criminal reporter, Peggy Lowe, actually covered that story, but she had some other things on her plate, an ongoing series that she was working on with Steve and Dan Margulies covering corruption in Kansas City, Kansas. And so it was handed off to Luke and me, and that was the start of it for us.
I'm just showing a couple of the headlines of the stories that you sent, which is really interesting to me as someone who kind of came into KCUR as this was all kind of unfolding. There were some hiccups along the road in this with the Attorney General weighing in, other parties weighing in. I mean, how is it, what's it like to cover a story like this when, you know, there's inherent emotional feelings built into it and then it takes a left turn?
It was, for me, like I have never followed a court case prior to this one. So I was really like learning, you know, I was starting from base one and really kind of learning as I went along. It was, honestly, it was like super difficult for me a lot of times my dog is barking. I don't know. Can you guys hear that? Anyway, it was like a pretty difficult for me because the story like got convoluted very quickly. I think this is probably the case with a lot of legal cases, but like, you know, there were just so many threads and these legal cases don't happen quickly, you know, and so it got like very convoluted. There were a lot of characters. There was a ton of background and history. I mean, this guy had been in jail for, you know, 42 years at that point. So not only, you know, was I having to explain why he was in jail in the first place, having to explain the crime that happened 43 years ago, and then I'm having to explain like the development of that day, you know, and I'm trying to do that all in like a 45-second spot. It was pretty darn difficult a lot of times, especially kind of at the beginning of this, to really like wrap my head around it and to try and figure out like, okay, you know, people don't need to know all of this. What is kind of the essential part of this that I can fit into that 45 seconds that will get people far enough along in the story that they know why we're reporting on it, why it's important.
CBS's Erin Priority is the reporter, so I just want to give her work that she had done. Luke mentioned how convoluted it was because, you know, there's the fact that you need to bring people up to speed so that they know why the story matters. But I think once people heard 43 years in prison and you hear the prosecutor say profound error, I think there's something about that that captures people right away, because what makes a compelling story in the first place is that people can imagine, oh my gosh, 43 years in prison and you're not guilty. One, how does that happen? And two, what's being done about it? So I think once that got out and people pretty quickly glommed onto that fact, the 43 years, then it hit some speed bumps. The Missouri Supreme Court declined to hear his case after the prosecutor said, look, there's been this profound error. The Missouri Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case, then the governor wouldn't pardon him. And so once those developments happened, the case really took on a life of its own, because it seemed, I think, to the majority of people that there must be some type of injustice if the prosecutor is calling for the need to revisit this case. And I think the one thing that really set it on a totally different trajectory was when the law was passed and went into effect in late August, August 28th, that allowed prosecutors to revisit convictions. Then it was a whole new ball game. So Luke, you want to pick it up?
Yeah,
from
yeah. So I mean, up to that point, like under Missouri law, Strickland's real only option was to basically, try to sue the county where he was being held. And so when we joined this story, when we started following it, that was kind of where he was. He had a habeas corpus case open in DeKalb County that had gone to the Missouri Supreme Court. The Missouri Supreme Court had declined to hear it at that point. And then, that case in DeKalb County eventually got dropped. I think that got dropped anyway. And the reason was because the judge in that case, and I think even the Supreme Court might have said that part of the reason that they didn't want to hear the case was because of the prospect of this law that Parson was going to sign, that the governor was going to sign, that would give prosecutors in the state this tool where if they had evidence of wrongdoing, they could go to the original court that handed down the conviction and put this petition in. And so, that is what indeed happened. Parson signed that law over the summer. And then I think it was a month and a half or so later when that law actually finally went into effect. It was the end of August. And that was when the prosecutor here in Jackson County was able to then file a petition on his behalf. So, from May until the end of August, Jean Peters Baker was telling everybody that he was innocent and she was trying to correct this, but she really had no legal say. There was no option for her to really do anything other than like file I forget what they're called, but friend of the court briefs, basically. She could write a letter to the judge and say, well, here's my opinion, but she really had no standing in the case. So she, the judge could or could not do whatever he wanted with that.
So it was
I wanted to just pop in and there's a lot of knowledge that a story like this requires you both to have. And it was like not really your beat. From an editor perspective, Vickie, I mean, the reporters look to us as having more knowledge than they oftentimes, or at least knowing where to find the knowledge. And then, we're looking to the reporter who's in the mix of the work. How did you kind of prepare yourself and keep yourself like on point and on track with this kind of story?
Well, thank you. First of all, I think that's a very nice compliment for the work that editors do. In this case, I think our newsroom was really captivated by the story. One of our reporters, who is also the morning announcer, Sam Zeff, has perhaps the closest relationship in the newsroom with Jean Peters Baker. And so she was telling him that when this law went into effect, she was immediately going to move forward on it. So that helped us a great deal, and that informed our decision making. And Luke is incredibly thorough. So if it's something that he's not sure about on Monday, by Monday afternoon, he's sure about it. So having those types of colleagues makes my job as an editor easier. So we were constantly talking about in the meetings, what are we doing next? So the law went into effect on August 28th, which was a Saturday. That Sunday, we had a team of people working on what we were going to publish on Monday, the 30th. And so Sunday, Luke wrote part of the story. I think Sam wrote part of the story. Our news director, Lisa Rodriguez, was also editing, and I was editing. And I just want to say this because it's usually related to like something really cool with music. And then we dropped it on Monday, August 30th. And that week, I think, was just supercharged with developments. So I'm going to run down the developments and then Luke can fill in the blanks if you'll allow me. So we dropped our story on the 30th. Luke put together a great piece, he and Sam did. The judge in the Jackson County courts, the 16th Circuit, set a hearing for September 3rd, evidentiary hearing in the making for 43 years. Finally, we're going to have this hearing on Friday. He even went so far as to say, bring Kevin Strickland to court on Friday. Now, the backstory, Kevin Strickland's mother had died. Her funeral was September 4th. So just think about it. On the 3rd, there's a hearing. The judge has said, Judge Kevin Harrell, bring him to court on the 3rd. Now, what would you think is going to happen on the 3rd, and his mother's funeral is the 4th? Luke?
I mean, I know what a lot of people were hoping would happen was, you know, all indications were that he was going to be released or whatever that would have to be. But, you know, not only did he not get released, he was never even transported to Kansas City. And the hearings never even actually happened because of delays from the AG's office. You know, they had kind of, I mean, they were fighting this case every step of the way, and you know, putting whatever roadblock, throwing in whatever delay that they could. They were doing it. And this was, you know, they weren't even necessarily a party to the case. There was a portion of the time here where, you know, there was a small squabble in court over whether or not the AG's office even had standing in this case. You know, so this was another minor thread that had to be sorted out. You know, was whether or not the AG could even take part in these Jackson County hearings. So
He filed for a delay. The Attorney General filed for a delay. And
his argument was that they needed more time, right?
Exactly. That they needed more time to prepare when everyone could see this was coming. But the Western Court of Appeals granted the delay. And by then we had already done a story on how this had become rather personal and political, because in the meantime, the Attorney General had subpoenaed communication between the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office and all third parties, which outsiders were saying was unprecedented. So this had clearly become about more than Kevin Strickland. So the Court of Appeals granted the delay, and I think we moved the next date for the hearing. Luke, do you recall, was like the 13th of September or something like that?
I don't recall. I think that one, they pushed it off a fair amount. I think it was like a month or two that they pushed it to give the AG. I think it might have been 6 weeks that they gave the AG to sort of, you know, collect their things on this case and prepare for the case. So yeah, but I wanted to go back and touch, you know, on something that Holly asked about, and that was just kind of like, you know, how we learned about all of these processes. And Vickie mentioned that it was truly a team effort. And that is true. I mean, I can't count the number of times when I was asking Dan Margulies, you know, like, hey, I just read this brief. Is this what it actually says? You know, I think this is what it says. Is this what it says?
Dan has a law degree. He's a former practicing attorney.
Right. And so that was a huge help. The other thing that was a big help to me were the attorneys involved in the case. Jean Peters Baker, and who was the Jackson County prosecutor, and Trisha Rojo Bushnell, who was on Strickland's team of attorneys, were both very helpful to me, you know, not only in, you know, giving me comment when they could, you know, something that I could write in a story, but even just like on background, I could call either one of them up, I feel like, and get a pretty quick response, you know, that would tell me. A lot of times it was like, you know, hey, we've got this hearing coming up. What are like the possible, can you explain to me what the possible outcomes are? And the big one for me was whether or not the parties could appeal the decision. And so they were super helpful and open. and pretty available to me. You know, they made themselves pretty available to me, which was a huge help. And I have heard from other reporters with more experience than I that that is not necessarily uncommon for attorneys. I will say, you know, the AG's office was not as helpful. I did not, I mean, the spokesperson or the media guy over there, Chris, always got back to me. He was usually very timely in getting back to me. And every once in a while I could get a written statement from him, but you know, 75% of the time he was like, yeah, we're not gonna comment on this. So, you know, I did what I could. You do what you can. You have to reach out and ask for the comment, but that is really, you know, that's who I have to thank for me being able to wrap my head around all of the different possibilities in really quick fashion.
So what I'm hearing is rely on the village, which is the newsroom. Be ready to like for anything, basically. And learn as much as you can if it's not your beat or if it's not a case that you've been following. And lean into the relationships that are offered. If the, you know, if your friend is the lawyer, then that becomes your, you know, your friend because they're talking to you. And I think that's really an interesting piece. I have one more question before I can turn it over to others, but one of my favorite stories was, I don't find it here, was the one about Kevin Strickland's hair. And I felt like that was such a good example of taking a moment that was a little bit, well, unexpected for me, at least, maybe not for you guys following it, but it just popped out at me as an interesting moment from all of these facts and figures that could also make this story even more relatable than it already was. And I wanted to know if when you saw this, you said, "Ooh, that's a story that I want to go deep on," or you were kind of like, "Well, this, you know, this is kind of unusual. I think I want to follow it down the rabbit hole." Like, what was your process in deciding to focus a story on this piece of the evidence?
I got the idea from Jean Peters Baker's arguments in court. You know, as she was arguing for his innocence, one of her planks was that that the timeline didn't match up with his hair, and the fact that he was pictured at the police station the day after this murder in braids, but the killer the night before had their hair worn naturally. And so the argument is, you know, was there enough time for Strickland to murder these three people or help murder these three people and then get his hair braided and then show up with old braids the next morning at the police station? I mean, you know, I think we can all kind of look at this story generally and see how race and culture like fits into it, how race fits into it. You know, an exoneration case, an innocence case, a Black man tried and, you know, convicted by an all-white jury. So that was one of the reasons that I was initially like, yeah, I'll jump on this. This sounds like something that I could do. But I was also kind of looking for like more explicit opportunities to really get into the race and culture beat. And so when I heard her make this case, when I heard her make this argument, you know, like the light bulb went off over my head. And I think it was the next day when I mentioned it to Vickie. And I think it was, you know, it didn't, the timeline wasn't the kind of thing where we had to jump on it immediately, but I think it was the day after I told her about it. She had discussed it with other editors and we decided to pursue it at that point.
I just love that, you know, this is a woman who's not Black, but she's educated herself about Black hair. And she, you know, it was such a cultural moment. Again, you're pulling back the curtain on a piece of life that many of the typical KCUR audience may not be privy to. And I appreciated that a great deal. So kudos to you all for seeing that as an opportunity in all of this to look at a very specific piece of culture and where culture is intersecting with the justice system. I mean, to me, that was really huge.
And I think the challenge in that story, which was actually perhaps my favorite in all of those we covered, was explaining to people who may not be familiar with Black hair and braids in particular about their appearance and how the state of your hair can provide a timeline for your innocence or your guilt, how it's almost an alibi, if you will, because I don't know that that is something that immediately comes to mind. When Luke mentioned it, he also brought to the forefront that in court during the testimony, there was such a difference in language. And we all know that there are cultural distinctions in language, you know, there are dialects and what's the other word? Accents that often tell our story. So this difference in the way people express themselves was one of the things that Luke picked up as well. So we were trying to decide, do we address this difference? Because sometimes a difference in language can make the difference between guilt or innocence. If you misunderstand, right, what I'm saying, then you just might not know. If I say I'm having problems with my whip, then if you don't know what a whip is, you know, you might not know what I mean. Okay, so in some cultures, a whip is a car, but you know, in most cultures, when we think of a whip, you know, it's something that you may use to inflict some harm. So we decided that might be too difficult to explain, right? And it opened itself to too much criticism that we might be judging. So then we said, Luke said, well, here's this hair angle that was brought up that Jean Peters. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is it. Because how many times have we heard people talk about African-American hair? There's the Crown Act where you can't discriminate if I have braids or that type of thing. And it was so key to their argument. So to me, like you said, Holly, it really was the intersection of culture and justice. And it was illustrative of how, as reporters, it's often incumbent upon us to tell those stories. It, in the end, educates and perhaps helps in the application of justice.
I would just
You
add
would-
that, like,
I personally would listen to a whole podcast about language in the justice system. So CJ, whoever takes over Mike Russo's job when he's gone, that is, and I want Vickie and Luke to do it because
Would love to do it.
huge. Oh my gosh. Okay.
yeah, I mean, I would just add that, like, you know, the hair thing seemed like a lot of stories in this, with this story, you know, a lot of stories could have been like, well, we're thinking theoretically about, like, we all know the dangers of having an all-white jury, and that can lead to, you know, convictions that maybe shouldn't be handed down. But you know, like, knowing how that happens is kind of nebulous. It's hard. Like, we know that that happens in a conceptually, but like, what does that actually look like? Like, here was an example of that in court. You know, if there had been even one Black person, I had a judge in California tell me, if there had been even one Black person on that jury, they would have known that something was wrong here, but there wasn't. And so there was not that knowledge that, like, hold on a second, these braids don't look fresh, you know, like, nobody even considered that. So yeah, I think it was a really great example. And just to, like, fill everybody in with language, it was like, Vickie's example was good. The thing that I was struggling with was even harder because Strickland's nickname was Nordy, Nordy. And people were referring to him back in the day by his nickname. But when some of his closer friends, people from the neighborhood, African Americans said his nickname, it sounded like naughty. And to a white police officer's ears, that was Naughty, naughty. But but you know, if you had heard somebody say naughty on the street and you were from there, you knew that they weren't calling someone a bad behavior. You know, they were talking about Norty, they were talking about Strickland. And so that was, you know, that was another wrinkle. That was the language bit that I was workshopping with Vickie about, you know, is this something, how do we make it something? But yeah, we ultimately went with the hair thing.
I think that's a really great, another place you could go with it, like another reason to have juries that are representative, you know, because of all the things that can get.
Absolutely.
Okay, let me open up for questions. Who has a question? Still have a ton, but I'm gonna let's go with Jonathan and then Steve.
I'm wondering if there is or was or is an opportunity to try to find another case where, you know, a verdict was overturned because of eyewitnesses recanting their testimony and or new evidence being played in with a white defendant. Because I think that, you know, that clearly, at least to my eye, what happened here is that he didn't get a fair shake because he's Black. But I think if you could point to another case where there were similar things in that new evidence was presented and eyewitnesses recanted their testimony, which seems to be the things that prove that Strickland couldn't be convicted. If those things happened in a case where a white defendant had their verdict overturned, I think that might be even more proving the point and really contextualizing the problem here. And I know that's a big ask, but did that ever cross anybody's mind, or does that exist out there as a possibility?
Well, this case recently, and I just put it in the chat, I don't know if this, Jonathan, it speaks to what you're saying, but what's his name? Michael Polite, is that how we pronounce it? Who served 20 plus years for allegedly killing his mother. Wins parole and it's leaving Missouri prison this April after 20 years. I think there was new evidence presented in his case. That's, you know, that's relatively new. I read about that, I think, earlier this week. So I don't know if that speaks to it or not, you know, to these underlying issues with the judicial system altogether, not just in cases where the accused is a person of color.
I wonder if we need to connect the dots though on those. Somebody, maybe they should, to kind of show the discrepancy and the disparity of that.
I think one of the challenges, well, it wasn't necessarily a challenge, but one of the things with this case was the fact that it was a precedent-setting case in Missouri. So a lot of the things that were happening, you know, as the case progressed through the courts had never happened before. We had never really seen these situations before, which isn't to say that we hadn't had, you know, people be exonerated or argue innocence petitions, but like the legal arguments are made in such a narrow set of circumstances that they can only be applied, you know, like for instance, one of the things was that Strickland's conviction did not depend on any sort of DNA evidence. And that's important because under Missouri law, exonerees can only be compensated if they are shown to be innocent based on DNA evidence. And so, you know, because of that narrowly interpreted legal decision, you know, and many of them like that, Strickland's case was really kind of singular in its time. There was a case, I honestly haven't followed up on it, but there was a case at the time in St. Louis that was almost identical to the circumstances of Strickland's case. Malcolm Johnson, I think was the name. I could be mistaken on that, but I know that the Innocence Project was working with him as well. So you know, there were other inmates and other people hoping to be exonerees who were kind of watching Strickland's case because it was going to have some bearing on their case. But yeah, I mean, The other thing, in terms of finding kind of parallels, where the defendant might be white, the problem there is that Missouri's Attorney General's office has a pretty terrible record of defending or arguing against these exonerations. Like almost in every single case in Missouri, when an inmate is making their innocence petition, almost in every case, the Attorney General will argue against that exoneration. And that goes back whether there's a Democrat or a Republican filling that seat. This happens, and I think there's like 20 some cases where people have been exonerated and the Attorney General was the whole time arguing against that exoneration. And it really, the fundamental question, we talked about the Missouri Supreme Court looking at this case before it opened in Jackson County. The question that they were literally, that was in front of them was, is innocence enough to free a Missouri inmate? If we know that this guy is innocent, is that enough for us to set him free? And they literally did not decide to hear that case. They opted to let him sit there in jail until the governor, provided the prosecutor a different way of getting him out. So,
I think at some point, I would just like to add, if I may, I think at some point, and I don't know who will tell this story, but there were a couple of unique things about Kevin Strickland's case. For one, he was the first person in Missouri sentenced to a mandatory 50 years in prison. He was the first. So his first case ended in a mistrial. There was one African-American on that jury. Second trial, there were no African-Americans on the jury. But again, he was the first person ever sentenced to a mandatory 50 years. He served 43 of the 50 years. Then he was the first case where this new law that went into effect on August 28, 2021, that allowed prosecutors to revisit convictions. So 2 firsts with this one guy. I would say for a man who went to prison when he was 18, he's done more than contributed to Missouri's judicial system, to righting wrongs.
I think there's another interesting cultural piece here, and I don't know how it would fit into any reporting, but I think it's very ironic that, one of the biggest issues of legal knowledge in a fictional sense was Legally Blonde, where, the court case is won because of a white attorney revealing the hair care of a white witness. And they got him on the hair. That's the whole point of that movie, is that Elle Woods knows that and brings it up in court and exonerates her client. But when it comes to black hair, when it's not a movie, when it's real life, it doesn't happen. And I don't know where that reporting would come in, or maybe if somebody does a podcast, they can bring that up. I think that's really interesting because culturally, we were all yes on the white hair, but not on the black hair. I think that's interesting.
Well, I think one of the things, and Luke and I talked about this, obviously we talked a lot, but Jonathan, I think there are just so many cultural differences that impact the way we view each other, whether we're sitting in a courtroom, driving down the street. It's just that in a courtroom, so much is at stake. There's far more at stake if we're in the courtroom and you don't have an appreciation of my difference than there is if I'm just shopping. It really does. It may be $20 or, it's money. It's not my life. But when the differences are so substantial, then it really does matter that we recognize how we are alike and how we are not. And not being alike is not a bad thing. It just means we're different. And I think part of the job as a reporter, not that we want to spend our time being advocates, but is that in the telling of the story, that it is nuanced enough to inform. it's not just a recitation of the facts. It's context. It's nuance that tells stories that move people. And this story moved people. Had it not, he would never have raised $1 million when he was finally released. But every living, breathing person, I believe, can imagine being imprisoned 43 years. You don't know what a cell phone is. You don't know what Hulu is. You have no idea that sort of thing, right? I mean, he's still talking about not being able to answer the phone. He was on our talk show a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, and he was still saying, I just finally learned how to answer my phone. And you cannot have a living, breathing heart, beating heart, and not have some part of you go, oh my gosh, there, but for the grace of God go I, right? I could have something like that happen to me or to my loved one. But I'm off my soapbox. But I think what made this story a national story. It's just 43 years. Are you kidding me?
Hey, Steve, you've been patiently waiting. Still have a question? Oh, I can't hear you. You're unmuted, but.
Gotta check the mute button.
Sorry.
on
There we
record.
go.
Yep. I'm struck by the similarities between this case and the Lamont McIntyre case. They both went to prison around the same age, and black hair was one of the crucial aspects of later exonerating him. But my question was, given that this became a national story, very competitive, and there was like almost a point where it felt like there were like daily developments, as it goes through the legal process, and then comes back down. I'm wondering if you can talk to the group and give some insight about how that aspect of the story made it affected your decision making in terms of like what types of stories you're going to pursue, what angles you're going to pursue, what you decided to leave aside, assuming that you did, maybe you didn't. But I'm always kind of struck when you're wrapped up in these national type stories, how you handle that. And I'm just curious what you would share about that.
I have to admit that I feel like I took a pretty straight ahead approach to telling, what happened that day, what was that day's development, and why was it significant. There were quite a few digital stories, but as many digital stories as got published on our website, there were probably twice as many spots. And so that was like, the big bulk of what I was writing, and maybe that's why it's like heavily favored in my memory. Was and as all of in a spot, like you're really limited as far as the story that you can tell. And so when I already had to give up one graph telling people why he was in jail and another graph telling people, like, we don't know what the judge is going to say, then you're really, at least for me, I felt like I really needed to be just direct with the story and what was happening that day. The other thing that made me feel fine about doing that was that there wasn't like an NPR person covering it. And yes, there were national reporters kind of covering it, but until his case made it to Jackson County Circuit Court and his hearings were actually happening, I didn't see any national reporters, as I was following the case on a day-to-day basis. A couple of times there was a reporter from The Intercept that I saw around here and there. But other than that, it was like me and Luke Nozika at the Star. And then, every once in a while there would be some TV cameras up at the courthouse. So yeah, I mean, I kind of really felt a certain sense of responsibility as far as, telling the NPR audience what was happening that day. So, the hair story is a good example of like one where we weren't just telling that day's developments. That was an opportunity for me to like dive into the race beat a little bit. The funeral, when his mom died and they had the funeral, that one was another one where it just seemed obvious that we needed to cover that. You know, like Vickie said, there was this big workup to it, and in the days preceding it, you know, all of the hopeful crowd was saying, you know, there's a possibility that he's going to be able to attend. He had already missed his father's funeral and his sister's funeral before that, and then that bubble burst. And but you know, I think Vickie and I and everybody, you know, could really look at the situation and see that like that story, that part of it was still worth telling because of the emotion that people, that is inherent in that situation. And so yeah, I think, you know, maybe that is the answer, is like is the emotion. You know, was there some bit of emotion in that development that we could kind of focus on to build a story around, and then I think that that would be something worth pursuing.
I also think if you guys recall, when the Attorney General wanted all of the judges in the 16th Circuit recused because the presiding judge had a communication with the New York Times supporting Strickland's exoneration, not the judge who was presiding over the Strickland hearing.
It wasn't even that, Vickie. It was something less, like even less damning than that. In fact, the presiding judge had written an official statement supporting his exoneration plea. So it was basically a document saying that me, as presiding judge of the 16th Circuit, I support this guy's right to go and fight for his innocence in court. And he provided that because Strickland's legal team reached out and said that if we can get the presiding judges, if we can get this letter from the presiding judge, that strengthens his argument a lot more. So, you know, it was really, the way I understand it, it was kind of this routine document, this routine statement that presiding judges make on behalf of prisoners who are seeking, you know, parole or different situations like that. And the AG's office really kind of took it out of that context and said, well, you know, the presiding judge thinks this guy needs to be exonerated. How can we trust him or any of his judges to rule in an unbiased way on this case? So yeah, it was really that. Yeah,
That was interesting. That was I think that kind of came out of left field. No one really expected that, and the Court of Appeals declined his request. Then the AG went to the Missouri Supreme Court, and the Missouri Supreme Court handed him a victory on that front. And that's when the retired judge from Clay County, Judge Welch, became the presiding judge.
I will also say, I mean, as far as like the competition goes, I do feel like it helped a lot. Like Luke at the Star was covering this thing wall to wall. He did like a really, really masterful job covering this. And so just like ingesting everything that he wrote about it was one way to kind of inform myself of, you know, what are maybe some of the threads like that don't get a lot of attention. The hair was one of those where, you know, like it became obvious fairly quickly that he wasn't going to do anything with that. And so, you know, maybe that provides us an opportunity as well. So yeah, it was helpful in a way to the competition for sure.
And one of the things, well, this will probably be our last question, but one of the things that is always interesting to me once a big story lands or is done, or, you know, the main arc of the drama is over, is do we need to do something else? And what is that thing? And how do we do that? And I wonder what kind of conversations you had about like putting a bow on this, or adding a ... and saying we're still going to revisit this later. Like what was your thought process there?
I mean, since the case ended, you know, Up to Date has really taken the lead as far as our coverage. I think they've had Strickland on the show a couple of times. And, you know, to be honest, I feel like, given the community interest in this guy and the fact that it was so hard to get him on the record, you know, on tape while he was in jail, I feel like at least for a public radio station, that's a pretty good way to approach it, because nowhere else is Kevin Strickland going to get 20 minutes on the air uninterrupted, to tell his story. And, you know, like Vickie said, to talk about the fact that this man is going to struggle with PTSD for the rest of his life. You know, so that's really where our coverage has gone since the case ended. And we've built a couple of digitals off of those appearances. Yeah, I don't know what else, Vickie.
I think you're right. People still want to hear from him, which I feel underscores, Holly, to use your word, the arc of the drama in the case. There is still this interest in his transition from prison life into mainstream life, and how is that going for him, that people still want to know what happened and how is he doing, because I believe that us as Americans want to see the justice system as just what we say it is, justice. It's just. And we want to believe that. And we need to see that completion. And I think that's why people are still interested in it. Plus, you know, when you hear him, he sounds sane, right? He doesn't sound like somebody who's been inside an institution for 43 years. He sounds like somebody who's still kind of figuring it out. But he sounds just like somebody you might run into down the street, perhaps, you know, just like a normal guy. And I think that part of our brain that admires resilience, admires the fact that he could spend 43 years in prison for something he didn't do and still be normal. It is quite a triumph of the human spirit. It really is. And if there's a next chapter, I think that may be it.
Yeah. Again, I would listen to a podcast where you just follow him around. You know, if he would let you, you know, I think that would be really interesting. But yeah.
I mean, the great thing about it is like it speaks to so many issues that happen in the criminal justice system. You know, even after he is not wrapped up in it, you know, there's the possibility of stories about the compensation bit, about, you know, reintegration and what, you know, we also the possibility, I've heard the possibility from Missouri elected officials about advancing some kind of law that would expand compensation. So, I mean, I think there are tons of, you know, none of those things are necessarily on my beat exactly, but you know, there are tons of follow-up opportunities. I guess because the legal system is so fucked up in Missouri, I guess. I mean, like,
I think you can fill in the blank with multiple states on this call.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Well, this has been really great. I'm really glad we recorded it because I think that this is a really interesting case study in what can happen in a case that has all kinds of unique features, but also has some common threads with the system, you know, that can't be ignored. And just really thank you so much for your great work. And I will get this link out to you guys too, so you can relive your big moment, Luke and Vickie.
Thank you so much, Holly. Thank you.
Well, have a great weekend, and thanks for joining us, folks. I'm going
Thank
to
you. Have a good
now. See you later.